Welcome to episode 45 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. Now, in this episode of the podcast, we're once again headed off in various directions across Europe. Firstly, with a woman who in 2020 was named by Cycling UK as one of their 100 women in cycling, and then with a cycling author who takes us to the heat of southern Spain. But first, whilst recovering from cancer treatment, Candy Whittome was given a copy of Anne Mustoe's book, A Bike Ride 12,000 Miles Around the World. It inspired her to embark upon her own cycling journey, if not quite all the way around the world, then a good portion of it. Her doctors were supportive, although her family did need some convincing, and in 2021 she set off on the first leg of her journey, cycling from Britain to southern Greece during the second summer of the COVID pandemic. I met her at the train station in York.
We will shortly be arriving at York, where this train terminates.
Customers are reminded to keep all personal belongings with them at all times. If you see anything suspicious, please report it to a member of staff or the British Transport Police. We hope you've enjoyed travelling with Northern today. As you leave the train, please mind the gap.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
You too. How you doing?
I'd completely forgotten what you said you'd be wearing.
Just sitting there quietly reading.
So I've been kind of up and down. But yeah, nice
Hi,
to meet you
Andrew.
finally.
Nice to meet you too.
Should we grab a coffee?
Let's
somewhere?
go for coffee. Yeah.
Do you know York at all?
No.
Oh, well, I used to be a student here, so it's actually quite nice. Good back.
I'm Candy. I'm a 60-year-old. I work at the Open University, and they've been good enough to give me a year off to do my cycling adventures. I come from down south, from Surrey originally, but I've lived abroad for 10 years and currently living in St Albans.
And your ultimate ambition is to cycle all the way around the world, which is a laudable thing to be doing, certainly for somebody who is not necessarily that young. We'll come to the trip in a few moments, but what is your history in cycling? Have you always been a cyclist? Is it something that you've adopted more recently?
I cycled as a child, as you do, on the way to school and university, but no, I never cycled what you might say properly until my mid-50s, and that evil thing called middle-age spread started to appear, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to need to do something about this. And I just like being on a bike, and so I thought I would give it a go, both as something fun to do and a form of exercise, and completely fell in love with it. Was lucky enough to join the Breeze group, which is the sort of women's cycling network, sponsored by different people, different times, and the group was just starting up in St Albans and Harpenden, where I live, at the same time that I was interested, and so I was in from the very beginning and met a wonderful group of women who have, been friends ever since.
Why did you join that Breeze group initially? What was the initial motivation for doing that?
I wanted to cycle with people. I wanted it as a social thing, and I didn't know where were the good roads to cycle around there. I didn't know anything, and originally I started out with they were sponsored by Sky at that time, and they were just local meetups. It was free. You just rocked up, and then someone would take the group who rocked up on a sort of 10-15 mile ride, and that was the best. It was usually men that were leading it, so it was a mixed group. So I was having to cycle probably faster than I was capable. But I remember going up a hill, slogging up a hill so slowly. And this really, really helpful leader of the group. And he was just sort of with me and encouraging me. And he said, just take it tree by tree by tree. And that was really solid advice. And when I was cycling up the Alps this year, I thought back to him.
There's a big leap from going out on a Sunday afternoon and cycling round St Albans or round the area where you live to actually deciding to cycle around the world. So what happened to make you decide that, yes, I want to take this to a completely different level?
Yeah, good question. So I've been cycling with the Breeze Group for several years, and we started going on holidays together. Sometimes to a friend who had a wonderful house in Mallorca, and sometimes on these guided trips, or not guided, self-guided, and the company takes your luggage. It's all incredibly civilised, whatever. But I realised then that actually it was cycle touring that really excited me. I've always loved travelling, and travelling by bike, I learnt. It was particularly in Mallorca. I think I sort of had one of those, an epiphany as we were cycling along in February, I think. So the weather in England was horrible. And the blue sky, the warmth, the smell of the almond blossom and the sound of the sheep in the fields along beautifully tarmacked roads. And I just thought, actually, this is such a great way to travel. So I was beginning to get in my head the idea I wanted to do more and more cycle touring. And then I got ill and was cycling, just starting chemotherapy, and was determined to cycle through it. And my cycling friends were really supportive, and I went on a little ride by myself and then got knocked off my bike and ended up therefore on the sofa, no hair and a broken foot, fairly fed up, thinking this is not what I planned for this year. And an old friend from university sent me a book by a woman called Anne Mustoe about a woman roughly my age, in her late 50s, well, actually early 50s I think, and she had cycled around the world having no training, really hardly been on a bike before, unfit, didn't know one end of the bike from another, and I just thought, you know what, maybe I can do something like this.
So the idea of cycling around the world, did that come after the cancer diagnosis? Was it already in the back of your mind when you were lying in the hospital, waiting for somebody to come along and give you a book, which would give you an excuse? Had it ever crossed your mind before that it might be a possibility, or was it during that period of convalescence?
Yeah, no, it hadn't crossed my mind. So in a way, I guess I'm grateful that happened, and it took a long time to really solidify. I read the book and I thought, actually, I wonder, because I love travelling, and I've increasingly over the last decade or so I've been thinking, what's a good way to travel? And I was thinking, if I were Bill Gates, how would I travel? I wouldn't want to stay in expensive hotels and see people that were sort of told to see me. I want to be talking to people. I want to, in a way, recreate the experience of when you're living in a country. And I like that kind of outsider experience. No one knows where I come from, and I don't know where they come from. So you're communicating on a really, in a way, sort of basic but very genuine human level. There's a real human interaction. All your assumptions, there aren't any, and I love that. And on a bike, you get that because you're not flashing past in the car or on a train, and you are smelling it, and you are eating it, tasting it, and you're going at a pace, and you can just stop when you want, and you're outside, you're feeling it. So,
do you think if that person had given you the book, and you were just sitting in front of your TV one afternoon, and you hadn't gone through the cancer diagnosis, you hadn't gone through the treatment, do you think it would have had the same impact upon you personally, or do you think that cancer diagnosis actually made you also value what you needed to do in the rest of your life?
Yeah, I don't really probably like to admit it, but yeah, I think that is true. I wouldn't. I'd have been interested, but I wouldn't have thought it was something I could do. But yeah, it does make you aware of how precious time is, and wanting to do the things you want to do and trying to make them happen.
So you've read the book and you've decided, right, I'm going to go off around the world. Did you at that point did you know anybody apart from the woman you've been reading about? Did you know anybody who'd done things like that? Did you know where to start? Did you know the kind of bike you were going to be taking? Did you have any idea as to the route that you would take? Were you starting from zero, or were you already kind of a little bit along the way?
I didn't have a clue. Not a clue. So I started reading, not just Anne Mustoe's books, but I was trying to find other people my sort of age, my gender, who had done this sort of thing, because I knew I'm not a super fit cyclist, male cyclist in my 20s. I wasn't going to go fast, I wasn't going to break any records, and I wasn't doing it for that. I was doing it to travel in a way that I wanted to travel. And I did find there are, if you look hard enough, you'll find a few women who've done that and have written books about it. I went to see a wonderful woman called Astrid down in Somerset who cycled around the world in a couple of years, and she was great and really encouraging. And I read more of Anne Mustoe's books, and then there was a Facebook group, travel cycling women. A few of us met up in London, and I met the wonderful Blanca, who was at the Cycle Touring Festival recently, who again was utterly delightful, helpful, encouraging. And I just started to try and put all these things together and look at endless websites and do the research. But I should say probably here that since I started, or maybe even before, the idea of cycling around the world has been modified a bit, because I began, I think, to realise my limitations. And so I've reframed it as cycling east, that's the bit I've already done, cycling west, which I'm hopefully going to start in April, cycling north, that'll be the summer, and cycling south, and that'll be next year.
And what was the reaction of people around you? And I'm thinking here not just about your friends and family, but also the doctors that were treating you for the cancer. What kind of reaction did you get from them?
They were brilliant. They were really encouraging, particularly one of my oncologists, who is herself a keen cyclist. And they just did everything they could. They changed the dates of my mammograms. They enabled me to get more pills. I still have to take some pills. And you're not meant to take more than a couple of months at a time, but they did it so that I had as many as I needed, and were just hugely supportive. And although I don't see this trip as related to cancer in many ways, I just see it as something I really wanted to do. I realised when I cycled up the two sort of big hills that I cycled up, the Jura and the Alps, the first thing I wanted to do when I got to the top of each of them was call. One time I left a message for one of the nurses at the top of the Jura, and another time I texted my oncologist, the woman, and sent her a picture. And I was surprised at that. I didn't realise that was important, but it was.
Would it be correct in saying that were your family more concerned than the medical community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have two fabulous girls in their mid-20s now, and it was hard for them. And that was, I think, it was the hardest thing for me in leaving. They had been so supportive when I was ill. They'd just been incredible. And of course, they wanted me to do what I wanted to do, but of course they were anxious. I mean, I would have been in their position, and as a mum, it's totally natural. So, that was just something we had to work through. But I knew that they were also really proud of what I was trying to do and found it inspiring. And as long as it all went according to plan, it would be worth it in the end. But it wasn't easy for them, and that wasn't easy for me as their mum, just to see me doing something that upset them in any way.
It might be a prosaic question, but what about insurance? If you're going through cancer treatment, and even if the cancer treatment is finished, there must be a certain period after the diagnosis and the treatment is finished where insurance companies won't go near you with a barge pole. How did you manage to sort that out?
Yeah, that was something that bothered me, but and again, I spoke to my oncologist about this, and as long as I'm not going to be claiming for anything related to the cancer, it's okay. So you don't have to declare it, and it wasn't likely that would be the case. If I found another lump, I would just fly home. So it was unlikely that the cancer was going to strike me in such a way that I couldn't get home. So no, age was actually more important. In the end, I found something, a good deal that I think one of these women my age who had cycled around the world, she recommended it, and I had to leave before my 60th birthday, which I did by about 3 weeks.
Right, let's move on from the diagnosis and talk about the cycling itself. The bike. Did you have a bike which you eventually set off on, or did you buy a new bike? And if so, what was it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been fairly cautious about the whole thing, I guess. And so I, again, Googled everything, spoke to everybody. Went on a brilliant weekend, the Royal Geographical Society's Explorer weekend, where all sorts of people have done amazing trips. And it's a fabulous group of people ranging from 18 to 80. And there's always a little cycling gang as well. And Tom Allen was there, and I was speaking to him and looked at his website, and he said, Richard Delacour from Oxford Bike Works, he's your man, and he's not far from me. So I went up and I tried a couple of other bikes, but his was so comfortable, and so he made me a bike.
Yeah, I've heard of that place. Bespoke Bikes. Yeah,
it's just so comfortable. She's a heavy girl, my Yaz, but she's fabulous.
She's called Yaz.
She's called Yaz.
And give us some of the details. Roll-off hub, Brooks saddle.
Roll-off hub, because I'm not a bike mechanic, and I just thought this bike's going to get thrown around a bit, and I'm not going to know what to do. So again, I took Anne Mustoe's approach very much as, well, I don't know about these things, so if something goes wrong, I'm going to have to get someone to help me, so let's try and minimise that. So roll-off hub. Brooks saddle, tried it, hated it, had to get a new one about 2 weeks before I left. Disaster. It wasn't going to work for me. Steel bike, the gears were fantastic. Schwalbe Marathon Plus tyres, never got a puncture, rode over sand and dirt track. Beautiful bike, really beautiful.
Yeah, I mean those tyres are bulletproof. They're kind of famous for well, I've had one puncture in 20,000 kilometres across Europe, and yeah, I swear by them. Absolutely wonderful. In terms of your kit, was that a hurdle? I mean, I would imagine when you went on your trips to the Mediterranean islands where people were carrying your equipment, I can just imagine you on probably quite a light bike, a racing bike, going around these corners without any panniers, just kind of living a wonderful life in the sun. But actually it's very different when you're having to carry everything yourself. Was that something that was an issue? Did you have to do a lot of research when it came to carrying your kit and what to take?
That was kind of my guiding mantra. So I had in my mind 15 kilograms, as that's all I wanted to take. And originally I had racks for front panniers, and I thought I don't think I need that. So I just had back panniers, and then I had a tent and a sleeping bag on the back in between, which I hardly used. And then a little frame bag and a bag at the front where I put all my valuables, so every time I went anywhere I'd leave the panniers on with all the stuff, because anything that was really important was in that little bag. So I spent a long time with one of those little luggage scale things, weighing each bag and adding it up, and of course it ended up probably being 18, but it was a good ballpark figure to aim for.
And by the sounds of it, you did set off with the intention of camping and cooking for yourself?
Well, I've never really camped a lot, but I wasn't averse to it, but I just thought, well, I'll take it and see. And I've never done my own cooking, I freely admit, but I did have a stove, and that I didn't use. I ended up not camping apart from a couple of times when I had to, because there was nowhere to stay. Really, because I found, I was pretty tired at the end of the day, and I kind of wanted to be warm, and I wanted to be able to have a shower, and just park my bike and be sort of comfortable, because I was doing it for extended periods, so it was 3 months, 3.5 months, 3 and a bit months, and I just thought, I mean, part of me still, I guess, sort of feels a bit guilty, and I was spending more money than I'd hoped, but then I just thought, well, if this is the way that it works for me, better to do it like this and maybe come back a few weeks early than flog myself to death and hate every minute. So
I think it's worth reflecting on the fact there is no one correct way to go cycle touring. Some people do it, well, everybody does it in a slightly different way. Some people at one end of the spectrum, they wild camp in bogs every night for 12 months. There are other people who will probably book into a 4-star hotel every night, and I think most of us are somewhere in between. I don't think anybody should really beat themselves up about how, or if they're not fitting a particular way of doing it, because there is no particular way of doing it.
Yeah, and in the end I just thought, well, look, at least I'm still doing it. I'm still cycling. And I learnt. In the end, I didn't use Airbnb much. I used Booking.com and would get the sort of the cheapest place I could find, but that wasn't a million miles out of town, because there were a number of evenings where you'd get to your place, and then it was quite a way, and you'd have to get your bike out again, which you were probably a bit tired of, and then there would be nowhere to eat. And so I learned what mattered. Also, breakfast was important.
More from Candy in a few minutes. Now, this episode's monologue comes from the journalist Chris Atkin. In 2018, he set off on a 1,300-kilometre cycle from Valencia, following the Spanish coast south to Gibraltar.
Hi, I'm Chris Atkin, the author and narrator of the newly released audiobook Just As Well It's Not About the Bike, a journey across southern Spain. Many of you will notice the book's title is partly a reference to Lance Armstrong's now notorious autobiography. The following clip is a sample from my book. In this extract, I cycle from Ronda to the small rural town of Alcalá de los Gazules. I began the day with a target of cycling 151 kilometres to Tarifa, the southernmost point of mainland Europe. This distance was considerably further than I'd cycled in a single day before, but I reasoned that as much of the journey would be downhill, I'd make it if I started early. The route passed through 2 national parks that cut a swathe of green right across the map, beginning just west of Ronda and running all the way to the coast. It was to be the final push, the last long day on the bike before I was back riding along the shore. I was already eyeing up the possibility of hiring a surfboard in Tarifa. Sadly, these aspirations did not come to pass. I set off early with the best of intentions and left Ronda's suburbs behind me as I cycled through fields of wheat illuminated gold by the rising sun. I was enjoying the stillness of the morning air and feeling good when I found myself at the bottom of a long, steep hill below the village of Benajuan. My calves begged for mercy as I grunted my way up to the traditional Andalusian-style houses built on the plateau above. I stopped briefly in Benajuan to recover while eating an orange, before resuming the gently winding ascent out of the village. It was only from afar that the beauty of Benajuan's setting was revealed. What before had seemed another nice, if unremarkable village of classic white buildings now shone like a jewel. Ensconced by towering, jagged peaks, it looked like a latter-day Machu Picchu. I kept cycling uphill and was soon level with the top of the adjacent mountains. The single-track road meandered around rocky outcrops and was only just wide enough for vehicles. I rarely came across cars, but when I did, drivers routinely pulled over to let me pass. As a show of thanks, I'd respond by increasing my cadence so the driver wouldn't need to wait for long. One jovial driver in his 60s acknowledged my efforts by impersonating me, puffing hard as he mimicked my pedalling by comically rotating his fists in front of his chest. I smiled in acknowledgement of his good-natured teasing. He obviously wasn't in a rush. In my experience, it doesn't matter which country you're in, the stereotype of people who live in the countryside being friendlier than the average city slicker rings true. You don't get that kind of gentle humour when you're commuting across London. The journey through the Sierra de Grazalema was a cyclist's dream. No hill too hard, but not so flat as to be dull. And just as the temperature began to intensify in the late morning, I entered an area of woodland providing welcome shade. Occasionally, snatched glimpses of the vast open plain below would emerge between the trees. It was like a cross between cycling alone on a sunny day in Richmond Park in London and stumbling into the land that time forgot. This may be a puzzling reference, as, admittedly, I didn't see any dinosaurs. Moreover, it is, of course, impossible to cycle alone on a sunny day in Richmond Park due to the constant stream of lycra-clad men around every bend. Just like in sections of the park, though, dappled sunlight streamed through the canopy of surrounding oak trees onto the winding narrow road. I made a similar, improbable observation when I visited the Tierra del Fuego archipelago at the southern tip of South America. I had long been excited to see what wild landscape awaited me in this land of fire, and was disappointed to find it was all quite familiar. Despite being the starting point for trips to Antarctica, the region is a similar distance from the equator as southern England. So while my imagination pictured a fiery Mount Doom from The Lord of the Rings, I arrived at the national park to find the same muddy paths and beech trees that I'd spent my childhood among. Different, but the same. Even so, there was something unusual about the oak trees of the Sierra de Grazalema. They had all been stripped of their bark to just above head height, exposing the red timber beneath. Shorn of their outer layer, the red trees appeared embarrassed by their nakedness. I attributed this to a forest fire, but I knew this didn't make sense, as there were no telltale signs of the flames licking up the sides of the trees, only a uniform height up to where the bark of all the trees had been removed. It was more like the trunks showed the high water mark of where a toxic, bark-dissolving flood had swept across the land. Inevitably, the truth is more prosaic. These trees were cork oak trees, and their red colour suggested they had been stripped within the last fortnight. Stripping only takes place once a decade, so I was lucky to see such an arresting sight. The bark will slowly regenerate using the carbon stored in the trees, and each tree can be expected to produce 1 ton of raw cork during its lifetime, the equivalent of 65,000 cork stops. Anyone with even a passing interest in cycling should visit this stunning stretch of countryside. It was no surprise to learn that 4 years earlier, these narrow roads had hosted Spain's most prestigious race, the Vuelta a España, which sits alongside the Giro d'Italia and the Tour de France as one of the 3 grand tours of European cycling. I smiled with giddy excitement as I navigated each turn of the road. After all the climbs of the past month, it seemed too good to last. It was. As I emerged from the wooded hillside onto the sunny plain below, along a road that seemed to run into the distance forever, my broken spoke came loose from its position, contorted around another spoke, and snapped it off. Bizarrely, the thought that came to mind was a scene from the movie Apollo 13. When an engine briefly cuts out during takeoff, Tom Hanks's Jim Lovell says to his crewmates, "Looks like we've had our glitch for this mission." I consoled myself with this sentiment. Unfortunately, just as was the case for Tom, I was out of the woods in only a literal sense. I stopped briefly at a viewpoint located where the Sierra de Grazalema in the north and the southerly Los Alcornocales Natural Park converge. In a nearby empty bar that I was shocked to find open, I bought a bottle of water. I was glad I did. There was only one other place selling drinks in the 42 kilometres that followed. That was a small, ramshackle restaurant built on a junction, 20 kilometres down the road. The owner there kindly refilled my water, and I sat outside on the gravel, which served, optimistically, as a customer car park. I'd hoped to have lunch at Alcalá de los Cozules, but it was already 1 p.m, and I still had a long way to go. Reluctantly, I accepted that I'd need to eat before I reached the town. I continued cycling, but, unable to find a pleasant spot for lunch, I eventually conceded defeat and collapsed onto a bundle of weeds by the roadside. Within minutes, ants had gathered around my banana skin, while mosquitoes, thankfully absent for the majority of the trip, swarmed around my sweaty body. Hot and bothered, but at least no longer hungry, I pushed on again. There was no longer any shade, but the descent towards Alcalá de los Cozules was marvellous. No one was in sight, and I could let my mind wander as I listened to the noise of the crickets in the bushes. The town of Alcalá de los Cozules sits at the summit of a vertiginous hill that rises from the valley floor. As I rode towards the white buildings above me, I cursed the settlers of bygone days for having the wisdom to build their homes in places that were so difficult to attack. I picked up my first puncture as I pulled into the town. After all these weeks and all of the unsuitable terrain I'd travelled across, I'd begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, I might make it to Gibraltar with my inner tubes intact. To my dismay, when I emptied my panniers to turn my bike upside down, I realised my predicament was worse than I'd first assumed. The bike didn't have a quick release mechanism to separate the wheel from the frame. Much like electric windows in the front of cars, I'd assumed that all new bikes, no matter how low budget, were now fitted with these. I was wrong. In place of where I expected to see the quick release lever was a very solid looking nut and screw that required a spanner to loosen. I had a basic bike kit with me, but to my shame, it didn't have a spanner. I'd like to pretend this was a deliberate decision taken to reduce the weight I was carrying, but in reality, it was simply a massive oversight. It was mid-afternoon on a Saturday, and almost all of the shops in the largely deserted town square were closed. It didn't look like I would be leaving Alcalá de los Cozules any time soon.
The book is available to buy from all good retailers. You can find out more about me by following me on Twitter or Instagram, where I'm @ChrisJat. That's Chris, J-A-T.
Thanks, Chris. If you'd like to contribute your own monologue for the podcast, please get in touch. All the contact details can be found at cyclingeurope.org/contact. Now, back to York and back to my chat with Candy Whittome.
Right, we're actually getting a bit ahead of ourselves because we need to talk about the route that you took. Now, you've talked about how your plans have developed since that first stage. Initially, you had in mind 3 different stages around the world, and the first stage was kind of the European bit. Could you talk about the route that you intended and the route that you eventually took for that first stage?
So the original plan was to get to Tbilisi on that first stage, but COVID messed. I mean, I had to delay leaving for over a year because of COVID.
Was the Tbilisi, Georgia thing connected to Tom Allen, because he's based over there, isn't he?
I don't know if is he. I didn't know that. I mean, I know has I think an Armenian wife.
I think he spends some of the year over there, certainly.
I have several people have told me that, and they've cycled all the way around the world, that Georgia was actually the best country of all. So I was really intrigued. I've got a good friend who has been there a number of times for work, and it just was raving about it. And so the original idea was to meet him and his family out there, and I just thought that would be a good ending place for that stage, because even though I'm really curious and want to go to countries like Iran and Afghanistan, I'm not sure at the moment they're a great idea for a woman on her own. So I was going to get to Tbilisi and then come back and then start stage 2 by going to Karachi. That was the original idea, and then go across Asia. However, I didn't quite get to Georgia. Again, mostly COVID related. I got as far as Greece, so didn't get across Turkey, but had to be flexible.
So what was the route that you took from? In fact, didn't you start off in Whitby?
Okay, so I did. People kept saying, "Aren't you going to do any training?" Or and I just thought, again, I went with Anne, who said she didn't do any training. She just got fitter along the way and stuff. And I thought that sounds like I'm lazy, basically. So I'm like, and there's no way I could cycle the amount I'm going to be cycling in my daily. So okay, fine. But I did think, it might not be a bad idea to just try out the kit and see whether I like it. So I did 2 weeks cycling up the East Coast. I got to Whitby and decided I didn't like cycling in England that much, but I did like cycle touring. Then I set off and I got the ferry from New Haven to Dieppe. Stayed with friends there. Staying with people I knew along the way was fabulous. And then because I was meeting someone in Geneva at a certain time, I actually got a train to Auxerre, and then I cycled from Auxerre through the vineyards, up over the Jura, down into Geneva, around the lake, up over the Alps, and across northern Italy, and then into Slovenia, and then actually had to catch a train back down into Bari because I couldn't get through the other countries because of COVID, and into Albania, and then over the hills and into Greece.
Okay, so clearly COVID did play its part in adapting plans, as it has done for many people over the course of the last couple of years in terms of their long distance plans. What were the highlights, would you say, between leaving the UK and arriving in southern Greece? What were the highlights of the cycling?
Of the cycling, that's really helping.
Is it midday?
Is it?
Oh no, we're only 1:45. In fact, we're okay because it's soon 1 o'clock.
Oh, okay. So
So
there's only be.
at 1 o'clock.
Going over the Jura and the Alps, in terms of the cycling.
Can you be more specific there?
Yeah.
Where did you cross the Jura and where did you cross the Alps?
I got to Les Rousses, was the top point of the Jura that I went to, and that was really big for me because I didn't know that I could do it. I think those were the big challenges, and it was at the beginning of the ride, so I was not particularly fit.
And it's worth pointing out that the Jura Mountains are indeed mountains. They're not hills. I think probably because they're nearer the Alps and you tend to ignore them. But you go to the Jura and there are ski stations at the top. You can go skiing there. They are sizable mountains.
They're very beautiful. They're wooded and lovely, and the gradient isn't too bad. But and it was a heat wave at that point, and that's why everybody had gone to the Jura, and that's why I had to camp, and I had to get up early in the morning because I'm not good at cycling in the heat. I'm not good at cycling in the cold, so I have a very narrow space where I can do it. So I had to get up early, and those sort of 3 hours between about 6 and 9, I knew were the only temperature I was going to be able to cycle in. Those couple of days, they were tough. So getting up there was fantastic, and then I thought, well, if I can do the Jura, maybe I can do the Alps. And then I just took the Alps really slowly, and I know you can easily cycle. Well, but you can cycle from Martigny over the Alps down into Elster in a day. It took me 4.
So which col did you go over?
Grand St Bernard.
Right. Okay.
And I was nervous. I really was. As I say, so a couple of days I cycled probably not more than 5 or 6 kilometres, partly because I thought I wanted to enjoy it, partly because I wanted to acclimatise to the altitude, and partly because I thought I couldn't do it anymore.
I think, having climbed the Alps myself a few times, I think the people who've never done it on a bike and who've perhaps never been to the Alps might imagine that the roads are very steep. Because they mainly are based on what we experience in Britain. British ways of getting up mountains is to basically point at the top and then build the road between the bottom and the top. Whereas if you go to the Alps, of course, and significant hills anywhere, you will obviously be on mountain passes or mountain switchback roads. And they're actually the challenge is in not necessarily the steepness, but the sheer length that you have to keep cycling for many hours or even days, as you said.
Exactly. That's exactly. It wasn't that they were vertical. It was just that they were long, and it was hot, and then it was cold. And I thought I would be able to. I did a sort of bloggy thing on an app called Polar Steps, and the night before I put it on. I'm going to be really annoying, and every time I stop, I'm going to post something because I'm going to need encouragement. And I stopped 10 times in 16 kilometres or something. But there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think climbing hills is more psychological than physical. Clearly there is a physical element to it, but you've just got to set your mind to get into the top, and eventually you will get there. And there will be people who zoom past you on a £15,000 Pinarello bike. Ignore them and just keep going on your roll-off hub and your heavy bike, and you'll get there eventually.
Exactly. And in a way, it gave me some pleasure to see that there wasn't anyone else doing it the way I was doing it that day. Nobody, doubtless there was the next day or the day before, but I thought, okay, so this is me today.
Why did you said you took the train down to Bari and then got a ferry across to Albania. Why did you not cycle through Italy? Was it not possible at the time?
I'd cycled all the way across northern Italy, and the original plan had been to go down the Adriatic, but different. Montenegro at that point was a red country, and I didn't want to go into that. I could have cycled all the way down to Bari, but I was meeting a friend at a particular time, so I got the train. A beautiful train ride, by the way.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah, and you went to you got the ferry to Albania.
Yeah.
Tell me about Albania.
Albania was probably the toughest part of the trip, but also the most memorable and the most rewarding. I was really lucky because a great friend of mine from many years ago came out to join me, so I had company the whole time, and that was really nice. I'd been on my own for quite a long time and was finding cycling on my own was getting me down a bit, so it was great to have company. We met. She flew into Tirana airport, I arrived on the ferry, and amazingly we managed to meet at some restaurant on some road somewhere going north from Tirana, and that was a really good moment. And then we cycled up to the north. They call them the Accursed Mountains, and it was quite dramatic.
Yeah, the Albanian Alps. I remember being in Albania, and actually, bearing in mind what I just said a few minutes ago about the roads in the Alps compared to in Britain, I think I made a comment in the book that I wrote that actually the Albanians must have subcontracted the building of their roads to the British, because they did go right up the side of a hill, and they didn't seem to have invented the switchback road.
Yeah, although actually Albanian roads in general, I mean, they were full of traffic, but if you took a side road, they were quite good. We avoided most of the big hills. We just went to different places. Came back down, and then went to the coast, went to wonderful wetlands nature reserve, and then headed east because we were heading over into Greece, and really some places that most tourists don't go. But the thing about Albania, I mean, I loved the countries, particularly where I'd never been before, because that's when you're sort of kind of on alert, and you'd have nothing to fall back on. You don't understand anything. You don't understand the language. You don't understand the culture, and so it's a huge learning experience. And people were much more open at talking to us than I thought they might be. I had no idea quite how troubled things had been, both during the time, Hodges' time, during the very, very strict communist regime, and then how complicated things had been after that, and since then I've become really quite sort of intrigued by the history and the politics and what's going on. And we met many young people who wanted to leave, but we also met a good number who wanted to stay and try and make things better. I remember one young man we met in a cafe who was working as a waiter. It turned out he was a qualified nurse, but he said he couldn't take a nursing job because if he did, he wouldn't have enough to pay his rent, let alone his food. And so he and many others were looking to come to England. And we were asking, well, how do people come? One chap told us that 2/3 of his school class had come to England. And we said, well, how do they get there? And he said, oh, the usual way, trucks, lorries, through Poland. And they were all working here. I mean, either they had been arrested, or they were probably working illegally, and it was thinking that was a better option than staying in Albania. That was really tough. But Albania is a beautiful country, and it has a huge amount going for it, but it's still really struggling.
Did you go to Tirana, the capital?
Yeah, we had a few days there. When there's amazing museums, the bunker museums. I don't know if you went when you were there, because one of the sort of guiding sort of concepts was this idea that there was going to be a nuclear war and that Albania was going to be attacked, and so there are bunkers all over the country. Most of them, they look like sort of concrete mushrooms, something like 168,000 dotted around the country. But Hodges and his allies, his group, obviously had an extended bunker, which has now been turned to an extraordinary museum showing the history of Albania. But it really gives you a sense of how closed in the country was. Effectively, there was like an electric fence all the way around. You really could not leave. It was the North Korea of Europe, and so when communism fell, there was neither physical nor institutional infrastructure. There was nothing. What did this freedom democracy thing mean? And it's still something that is being figured out.
Yeah, I remember Tirana for quite a few reasons, but I remember the painted buildings because
Yes.
Eddie Rama, who was then the mayor of Tirana back in 2015,
Yep.
he's now the Prime Minister, I think,
Yep.
and he had basically instigated this program where people were encouraged to paint their buildings, and I thought that was really nice, and it certainly brightened up the place. The other thing I remember particularly was I think it was originally built for Enver Hoxha to his tomb, which was this phenomenally ugly structure in the centre of the city, which was, I think it was so emblematic of the communist era. It hadn't been pulled down. It's very difficult to describe. It was kind of like a pointed, not quite a pyramid, but it was just a skateboarder's dream, and I think that they'd kind of taken it over. Is that still there, and have they done anything with it? It's 5 years between our respective visits. I'd like to think they'd done something with it.
Yeah, to be honest, we only spent about a day looking around Tirana, because then we actually went out onto the coast for a couple of days.
So you arrive in Greece. Now I looked at your map earlier, and it looks as though you certainly cycled some of it back to Britain, some of it on trains.
Yeah.
Can you explain how you got back from Greece?
Yeah, so at that point, now we only have 90-day visas cycling around Europe. Obviously, Albania didn't count, not part of the EU, but so I had a deadline. So I cycled a little bit from Athens to Patras along the coast there. Utterly gorgeous, and that was good fun because it was kind of October-ish, and I knew the weather in England wasn't very nice, and I was posting all these pictures, and people were getting pretty cross. But it was gorgeous. Mostly then it was trains and ferries, and then the bit that I hadn't cycled from Auxerre to Dieppe, I wanted to fill in, so I did that bit. Yeah.
Did Cycling UK make you one of their 2020 100 Women in Cycling before or after the trip?
Before.
Of course, yes, of course, because I'm getting my chronology wrong here. Of course they did, because that was 2020.
Yeah.
Your trip was in 2021. What encouraged them to give you that accolade? What was the motivation for them including you on the list?
Yeah, it was very, very nice of them. I think they were intrigued at the idea of probably someone my age doing something like this, and maybe after being ill, and just wanting to promote cycling not just as a sport where you have to get into your lycra, but as a way of living. And they've been and are continuing to be really supportive of the trip. And as I was cycling along at this first stage, it became more and more important to me, the idea that I really want to do what I can to promote cycling in the UK as a way of life, as it is in Copenhagen, as it is in the Netherlands, not as something that you have to go out on a Sunday on your fast racing bike in lycra, as a way to get around, because it's so good for physical health, it's so good for mental health, it's so good for the climate. There's no downsides. But I have a number of friends who agree with all of those things, but say they're just too scared to get on a bike. And to be quite honest, I don't blame them, because it's not safe in this country, and it's going to require real commitment and real money to put in the infrastructure and to promote cycling as part of our lifestyle, and so So Cycling UK are going to be, are the charity that I'm supporting as I go along, and I just want to do more and more to promote what they do.
The normalisation of cycling is a very big challenge, and if we ever get anywhere near the level of normality that it is in the Netherlands or in places like Denmark and other places as well, even places like Germany and Belgium, and even France. It is the norm increasingly for towns and city centres to be basically getting rid of the cars and the motor vehicles in preference to more active forms of travel. But we're here in York, and even here in York, people are still driving around on very narrow streets which would be far better pedestrianised, and people on their bikes.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, Ljubljana in Slovenia is a brilliant example. It's pedestrianised and there for cyclists, and it's just a really healthy lifestyle that is promoted. And so the city is quieter. There's a bustle, but it's not traffic. It's healthier. I came away thinking that whereas in England people tend to hate cyclists, in France they respect them. In Switzerland, Germany, they really, really like them. And in other countries like Denmark and Netherlands, just everyone is a cyclist. And just on the Copenhagen thing, I was there a few years ago, and was so struck by how cycle friendly the place is and all these protected cycleways. And so I was reading up a bit about how it became like that, and it wasn't always like that, and it was a concerted effort by some of the politicians there, I think in reaction to a tragic accident where a child had been killed. And it took a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of convincing people on the part of the planning department and the politicians to say, no, we're going to do this differently. And people at first didn't want it. Even in Denmark they didn't want it. And now look how amazing it is. So it can be done, but it requires a lot of effort.
Right, thinking about stages, well, I reckon stages 2, 3 and 4. Bearing in mind you've now stated that your plan has changed, so you've headed east. You're now going to head north, west and south. Heading north, well, that kind of takes you to the edge of Europe. Heading west, that could be a long way. Heading south, that could take you all the way through Africa. So what's next, and where's the route going?
So actually I'm calling it, so it was cycling east, so that was from here to east, and now I'm going to have to, I had hoped to get on the Trans-Siberian Railway and get to Vladivostok, but all of that has been put on hold by COVID mostly. So I'm now going to have to fly, which I really didn't want to, but I can't see any other way, and hopefully get into Vietnam, which looks like it'll be open by mid-March.
So you don't consider the eastern bit yet finished by any stretch of the imagination, just interrupted in Greece?
Well, I'm calling it cycling west because I'll be cycling from a point in the Far East to the west. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay.
But definitely not. And I really, and then I don't think I'll get beyond Thailand. And I really want to fill in the bit between Thailand and Karachi at some point. But that'll be another day, another adventure. So the next stage is Vietnam, hopefully, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. That's going to be, I'm calling that cycling west because I'll be starting from an easternmost point to a more western point.
And you need to be back at work, you said, in October?
1st of October, so yeah.
So when do the other bits fit in?
So north will be in the summer, in early July to September, through September. And then south will have to be next year, in my holidays next year.
Okay. And how far south will you go?
As far as I can get. Literally, I'll start probably at the northern tip of Africa and just head down.
Now, you've been inspired by people like Anne Mustoe, and there are plenty of good examples of women who are not in their 20s, 30s, 40s, who are a little bit older, setting off on their travels, whether it be people like Dervla Murphy or Josie Dew, and also at the Cycle Touring Festival this year we heard people like Blanca and other people as well talking about their experiences of cycling. Do you think there are any particular challenges that a woman who is over 50 might encounter that other people might not encounter? And also, do you think there are some advantages to be in that group of people?
Yeah, I think being a woman in your probably 20s and 30s might be in some ways harder. When my friend and I were in Albania, we agreed that one of the advantages of being our age is that really, honestly, we didn't think people were interested in our bodies anymore. They might be interested in our wallets, but really not, and they weren't anyway. So, yeah, and as a woman, that is, sadly, it is something that is forever on your mind. So to realise that really we didn't need to worry about that too much was a good thing.
How about the mental side of it? Do you think, do you care what people think about you? I think anybody who starts cycle touring, me included, you've got to go through a period of kind of thinking, oh, this is a bit weird. I feel very conspicuous. Don't feel comfortable doing that. Did you have those barriers as well, or were you actually quite confident in what you were doing?
I mean, at the beginning I was just cycling through Western Europe, and so that didn't feel odd because there's lots of people cycling, and so no one really noticed. I think it wasn't really till Albania that we felt a bit different. And by then, you'd got a bit sort of, battle hardened. And it was easier with two of us. I'm not sure I would want to go to places now that I'm so much less familiar with on my own. So when I start in Vietnam, I'm actually going to cycle I'm going on these tours. I'll take my bike, but I'll go with them. So I've got a group just to get used to cycling in Asia, because it's not something I've done before.
And Africa?
I don't know. I'll see. My friend might come with me to Africa, and that would be fine. Or I'll find a way to do it. I'll talk to Blanca.
She's the expert.
She's the expert.
Okay, finally, if there is a woman in their 50s, 60s out there, has never really done much cycling before, what pieces of advice would you give that person to perhaps encourage them to emulate something that you've done?
I think you need to like cycling. I think that sounds pretty obvious, but I just like being on a bike. It makes, in a strange sort of way, it makes me feel powerful. So if that resonates with you, if you like being on a bike, then I think absolutely anything is possible. Take it slow, I would say. I mean, really, speed. It's not about speed. It's about doing it the way it works for you. So if cycling is something you enjoy, the world is your oyster.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks to both Candy and to Chris for their contributions to this episode of the Cycling Europe podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with the podcast, you can do so by emailing podcast@cyclingeurope.org or by posting a message either to the website itself, cyclingeurope.org, or via social media where you'll find me at Cycling Europe. As mentioned earlier, you can find all the contact details at cyclingeurope.org/contact. If you've enjoyed listening to this episode of the podcast or any of the previous 44 episodes, please consider adding a rating or review on your chosen podcast platform. You might also want to make a donation to help support the podcast and the website. Details as to how to do just that can be found by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. And if you choose to help in that particular way, it would be much appreciated. Join me again for episode 46 of the Cycling Europe podcast, when I'll be talking to the best-selling author Tim Moore about his cycling journeys and his books. In the meantime, thanks for listening, keep pedalling, and happy cycling.